In this video, I will show you how to create and run an ASP.NET Core Web API. So let's click on Create a new project. Then here let's select C# and Web, and let's select ASP.NET Core Web API. So if you don't have this option, then we need to scroll down. Then let's click on Install More Tools and Features. Then in this window, we need to install this component. So it is ASP.NET and Web Development. Now let's select ASP.NET Core Web API, then Next. Then let's provide a name to this project, then Next. Then here let's select .NET 9, let's check this box to use HTTPS, and let's check this box to use the OpenAPI documentation, then Create. So this is the created project, and if we expand the controllers folder, we can see that by default we have this controller. So now let's create a new API controller. So we can make a right click, then add, then controller. And here let's select API, then API controller empty, then add. We can call it products controller, for example. So this controller will be accessible at the URL /API/ the name of the controller without the controller word. So it will be accessible at the URL /API/products. Then let's create an endpoint that will be accessible using the HTTP GET method. So here we can use the attribute HTTP GET. Then let's create a method which is also called action method. So we can create this method. It is accessible at the URL /API/products, and it is accessible using the HTTP GET method. It returns a string which is HTTP GET request. Then let's create another method that will be accessible using the HTTP GET method. So we can copy this. And let's define an extension to the URL of the controller. So here between parentheses, we can add a string. And let's call this method getCategories, for example. So this method will be accessible at the URL /API/products/categories. And you can change the text that we have here. Then let's create another endpoint that will be accessible using the HTTP POST method. So we can create this method, and it will be accessible using the HTTP POST method at the URL of the controller, which is /API/products. Then let's create another endpoint that will be accessible using the HTTP PUT method. So we can copy this, and let's paste it here. Let's change the attribute. So here let's write HTTP PUT. And let's add the ID to the URL. So we can add parentheses, then let's add a string, then let's add brackets, and between the brackets we can define the name of the variable. We can call it ID, for example. And to read this ID, just here we can add a parameter. Let's say it is of type integer, and let's call it ID as the name that we have here. So we can call this method edit. And here let's write HTTP PUT request. Then let's create another endpoint that will be accessible using the HTTP delete method. So let's copy this. And let's paste it here. So here we can write HTTP delete. Let's call this method delete. And here let's return HTTP delete request. Let's save the file. And let's run the application. So here we can see that the application is running and it is available at this URL. So to find the documentation of the API, we need to copy this URL. Then let's paste it here. Then let's add /OpenAPI/v1.json. And we obtain this API documentation, but it is not user-friendly. So we can visualize this API using Postman. So let's click on raw data and let's copy this document. Then let's go to Postman. And here let's click on Collection, then Import. And here let's paste the JSON document. Let's select Postman Collection, then Import. So we obtain this collection, and we have these endpoints. So let's test this endpoint. So we can click on it. Then here let's click on Send. And we obtain this response, HTTP GET request. Another way to visualize the API is to use Swagger UI. So let's stop the application. Then let's add Swagger UI. So we can make a right click, then manage NuGet packages, then browse, and here let's write Swagger UI. Let's select this package and let's install it. Let's close this page. And let's go to program.cs. Then we need to configure the pipeline to add Swagger UI. So just here, we need to add app.useSwaggerUI, and we can configure Swagger to use the API documentation that is available at this URL. And here we can provide any name, which will be the name of the Swagger endpoint. Now when we run the application, we need also to run the browser. So let's go to the Properties folder, then Launch Settings. Then let's enable the browser, so we can set Launch Browser to True. Also let's define the launch URL. So it will be Swagger. Now let's save all the files and let's run the application. So we obtain this page, and here we have the different endpoints that we created in the products controller. And this is the default endpoint of the weather forecast controller. Now let's test this endpoint. So let's click on it, then try it out, then execute. And here we have the response. Then let's test this endpoint. So let's click on try it out. And here we need to provide the ID. Then let's click on execute. So here we have the response, which is HTTP put request.